Hey everybody, welcome back to the next episode in my Dialing In series. And today I'm going to cover a question, or I should actually say a series of questions I get asked a lot and have been asked a lot about over the past number of years. And that is where we should have our global settings set to. Now, I've covered this information kind of piecemeal throughout different videos. I have a video about the guitar input pad dedicated just to that, and as one example, but I thought it might be a good idea as part of the Dialing In series. I guess this could also go into the Creating a Great Tone series, that we just take a look at each individual global setting within the Helix and figure out what it does, whether it's something that's going to actually apply to us or that we need, because the Helix is a very in-depth piece of hardware. And there's a lot of features that were put in there by the fine folks at Line 6 that may be very useful for some and may never be used by others. So I do get a lot of questions from folks asking me, what does, this do? And I kind of go, well, it's probably not something you need because the way that you've described you're using it, it's not going to apply. So I'm going to do this in separate parts. Today, we're going to talk about the ins and outs. So without further ado, let's go over to our Helix. So here we are over looking at our actual physical Helix hardware unit. As you'll notice, I'm on a normal preset page on my screen. So I'm going to first go over here to the little hamburger button, press that, and we notice a menu comes up along the bottom. We have bypass, assign controller, assign command center, global EQ, and global settings. We're going to be looking at global settings today. I'm going to try to keep my hand out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. I apologize if it gets in the way. So if you notice, once we hit global settings on this little knob button right here, it shows us the global settings. It shows us the firmware version that we're on. It also gives us the choice of ins, outs, preferences, MIDI tempo, foot switches, expression pedals, and displays. And we can use, I don't even know if this is on screen, probably just over here on the right, we can use our little joystick to scroll through those. So we're going to be focusing on ins and outs. But while we're here, the menu along the bottom over with our page button can also be scrolled through. So we see there's a lot of settings for global settings just for ins and outs. So let's take a look at these one at a time and figure out what they do. The guitar input pad is interesting. I have a whole video dedicated to that. I'm going to try to remember to put a link in the description below so you can watch that video if you really want to dive into talking about the guitar input pad. The folks at Line 6 say we can either turn this on or off. And by turning it on, it basically lowers the amount of input level going into the Helix. So if you have very high output pickups, very hot pickups that are going to maybe clip the converters in the Helix, or maybe just you don't like the sound of it because it's hitting the front end of the amp too hard and maybe distorting things too much, even on a clean setting, we can engage that and it's going to pull that back so the front of that amp and the front of the Helix isn't going to be hit as hard. So it gives us a little bit more control over our sound and potentially fixes any problems with distortion that we may have. I normally keep that off. That's really going to be a personal preference thing. Mic in 48 volt phantom power. This is one that I've been questioned about a lot. When I turn this on, this is going to send 48 volt phantom power, as it implies, to the XLR microphone input. Nothing to do with the XLR outputs on the Helix. It is only going to affect that. Now you might ask why we need that. Certain type of microphones require phantom power, or else we will not get any usable signal out of them. So if we're using our Helix as a microphone preamp, which it really does a very nice job at, and we have a microphone that requires 48 volt phantom power, we would turn this on to power the microphone. We would probably want to make sure we have it turned off before we connect the microphone or disconnect the microphone. It's just a good practice and the safest bet. We probably just want that turned off if we're not using a microphone that requires that. In fact, there's some microphones, such as certain ribbon microphones, that if we did engage phantom power when they're plugged in, we could do serious damage to the microphone. So something to keep in mind. I would just keep that off all the time if I were you, if you're not using a microphone, or even if you're not using a microphone that requires phantom power. And you can find that information in your microphone user's manual. We go over to mic gain. This also only has to do if you have something plugged into the XLR input or the mic preamp. The mic that we plug in may require, and again, it really depends on the type of mic you have, it may require a lot of gain to get up to a usable level. So here in the Helix, we have up to 60 dB of gain we can add, and we would just turn that up until we get the appropriate level on our microphone that we are recording with. Next is mic in low cut. And all this is going to do is allow us to do a low cut on the microphone input. So if we are recording, let's say vocals like I am at the moment, I'm not actually doing it through the Helix. for this video, since it's tied up with what we're doing here, we could actually, let's say, on my voice, I wanted everything below 100 hertz cut out. Much like we would use a low cut on an EQ block or on a cab block in the Helix, we would use this the same way, just to cut out any low frequencies that we don't need. So again, if you're not using your mic input, it doesn't really matter what that's set to. I know a lot of folks have just never used the mic input on their Helix. Other folks use it all the time. So, anybody who doesn't use it, these three settings are probably never really going to be needed. Over to the next setting, USB in 1.2 destination. The Helix is a really interesting device in that it can be used as a really full-featured recording interface, USB recording interface to use with our DAW. So we have choices here. The USB in 1.2 is going to be a signal that comes in over the USB connection that will not be processed by anything we have going on our signal chain. So if we're listening to a video on YouTube with our Helix set as the audio interface, and then we put an amp block on with distortion, it's not going to distort the YouTube video we're listening to, or the music we're listening to, or whatever we're feeding in via USB. So we want to know where the destination of that's going to be. So our choices are XLR, 1/4 inch, or multi. Now, normally I would leave this on multi when using it as a recording interface, because that's going to allow whatever I am feeding into it, whether it's from my computer or whatnot, whatever use I'm using it for at the time, to just feed it to the back to the outputs that I'm using to monitor off of. Now, let's say there could be a situation where I don't want that to be going through my monitor, and I only want it to be routed off to the 1/4 inch outputs because I have that going to some other set of speakers, I guess, maybe. Or maybe I want it going out the XLRs. This is really, I can't tell you when you're going to need this. This is really going to be up to you, but maybe there is a time where we don't want to hear, the YouTube video through our main studio monitors, and we want to have that routed somewhere else. So we have the USB 1.2 going in there, or we want to do direct monitoring while we're recording in our Helix, and we want to send that USB 1.2 out to possibly a different monitoring system. So it's really hard to say where you would use this for your personal situation, but it's good to know that we can route that to different places. I would say most people would usually probably just leave that on multi. Now we go over to the next control, which has to do with this USB in 1.2, which I just described to you what it does. It allows us to trim or boost the volume of that. Let's say I had a preset that was set up with a certain volume, and I was, using the direct monitoring feature on the Helix, where I'm not monitoring it from my DAW, but rather just from the Helix hardware unit to avoid any latency when recording. Maybe I have a mix that's fairly low in volume and my guitar preset is overpowering it, and I still want to use the direct monitoring. Well, I could come in and boost the level of what's coming back in from my DAW on USB 1.2. Got to be careful you don't push it into distortion, but if you have the headroom, you can crank this up. Maybe it's the opposite, and we need to trim back the volume of whatever's being fed in on our previously mentioned USB 1.2. We can do that here as well. So very useful. So now we're going to page over, and we get a whole other menu page. Now this one's going to be pretty self-explanatory. We have 1/4 inch outputs, XLR outputs, send return 1, send return 2, send return 3, and send return 4. Now, this is where we're going to set the appropriate signal level of these inputs and outputs. Obviously, the 1/4 inch and XLR are both outputs, but the send and return are combos between the send being an output and the return being an input. Unfortunately, we have to change those in pairs. I've done a video before where I've had to use two of them because I think it was the 4-cable method. I wanted one of the sends to be set to instrument, and I wanted the return to be set to line. So the settings here are going to be extremely dependent on what we are sending our signal to. For instance, if I was sending out of the 1/4 inch outputs to my power cab 212 or 112, the power cab wants to see a line level signal. I would want to make sure that's on line output, not instrument output. The instrument output is going to be a much lower level signal. So that's not what the power cab wants to see in that particular case. But let's say I'm using a 1/4 inch output to feed the front of an actual guitar amp, which wants to see a guitar input signal. Maybe I'm setting up 4-cable method. I would want to set that to instrument. So each of these can be set to either or. XLR can be set to either line or mic. Now the XLR outputs would be feeding the mic preamps on a recording console or a live sound console. In that case, we wouldn't want to send them the line level. That might be too hot for it, and it might distort the channel. So if we peel that back to mic, then we have an appropriate signal going out to it. But again, I can't tell you where to set those. It's going to be dependent on your particular situation. Likewise, we have line and instrument on all of our sends and returns. And again, it's going to be dependent on what the destination of your outputs or what you're sending into the Helix wants to see or wants to send, I guess we could say. And you can always check the manual of the gear that you're hooking up to. And, you know, I believe in the power cab manual, it says very clearly that the Line 6 power cab wants to see a line level signal. So depending on how you're sending it out to the power cab, we would figure out which output we're using. We would set it to line. So that whole menu page basically takes care of itself because it's all very similar, just dealing with the numerous input and output combinations on the Helix itself. So we'll page over again. Now we end up with a lot of different settings that we may not understand. So we have two reamp sources here. We have one for guitar and one for mic, as you see the settings, but it's actually USB 7 and USB 8. This is a feature I use a lot on the Helix, and I mean a lot. So every time I do a demo for a marketplace preset, let's say, or a musical demo or a session or one of my own composing sessions when I'm writing for a musical release, I always record my processed guitar sound going through whatever preset I'm using, but I always record at the same time on a separate track the dry unprocessed guitar signal, which would give me the ability to go back and reamp that signal at a later date. That has saved me so many times from having to go retrack complete sessions or complete songs or complete parts. One example would be, and I don't really run into this too often, but one example could be, what if you were to do a session and the producer, engineer, client loved everything about the performance but didn't like the tone? They would probably come back to you and say, can we get that with a different tone? Well, it would be a shame to have to re-record the entire performance, and maybe you had some really magical things going on in that performance just so that you could change the tone. With this, we could just take our original performance and reamp it back through a new preset, alter it in whatever manner we need to, and it's a really wonderful thing. So what are the options here? Well, we can set the reamp source to guitar. We can set it to aux input. We can set it to variacs. We can set it to variacs magnetic pickups, or we can set it to mic. So if it was set to mic, for instance, whatever microphone I had plugged into the Helix, I could put that on a path up here in my normal preset and set the input to mic and process that maybe with compression or reverb or whatever, or EQ, whatever we thought we wanted. But what if we didn't want to commit to only having that? Well, again, what we could do is we could say, okay, well, I'm going to set this to mic on USB 7, set another track, set the input to USB 7 on it, record that mic dry also, so we could go back and EQ it and compress it later and just get the direct signal from the microphone coming out, much like we would with the variacs, you know. So these are all different settings we have. If we plug the variacs in and we have guitar set here, we won't be able to record the dry unprocessed signal. By putting it on variacs or variacs mags, we will be able to do that. So just an option we want to have. So I always, and by default, I believe the Helix is set with USB 7 output set to guitar and USB 8 set to mic. If you wanted to reverse that for whatever reason, you have that option and you can make the settings here. Next, we move over to volume knob controls. Now, this is going to be controlling your, I don't know if you can see it off screen, but your big master volume, your big knob over here. So when it's set to multi, it is going to affect the volume going out of all of our different outputs. Okay, so if I turn that down and I'm set up with, you know, something hooked up to 1/4 inch and XLR and digital, when I turn this down, it's going to affect all of that. But maybe we don't want that. Maybe we only want it to affect something that we are sending to the 1/4 inch and the XLR, and to leave the digital alone. Maybe we only want it controlling what's going out to the 1/4 inch. Maybe we only want it controlling what's going out to the XLR. Maybe we only want it controlling what's going out to the digital. So if we put it on digital, then when we're using this in a live setting, the main master volume knob is meaningless. It's set to unity gain, which is equivalent to being turned fully clockwise, or the loudest setting it is possible to have it at. So if you want to get rid of your volume knob functioning when we're playing live and just always have it as if it's on, we just leave that on digital, okay? But we also have these choices where we can set it. And again, I usually just leave mine on multi, but there could be particular situations where I would want to change that. Then we have headphones monitor. This is going to determine what we hear from the headphones. Are we only hearing what we are sending to the 1/4 inch outputs? Are we only hearing what we're sending to the XLR? or are we hearing multi? So again, really, I can't tell you where to set that, but you're going to have to make that decision. But the nice thing is we have the flexibility of setting that. So as you can see, a lot of these functions may not be useful for a lot of folks. You know, most of the time I don't really deal with these because I just have them set the way I want for almost all situations I am using, and I just leave them alone. Digital output. So on the Helix, we have two different types of digital outputs. We have an SPDIF or SPDIF, which depending on how you want to pronounce that, in and out. And we have an AES EBU digital connection. And that also doubles as the L6 link output, which we can use to connect to a power cab or other line 6 devices. And we can actually control the power cab from our Helix. Very cool feature. I use that a lot with my power cabs. A lot of folks ask me about this. What's the SPDIF output for? What are the digital outputs for? And chances are, if you don't know what the SPDIF output is for, you probably don't need it, I guess I could say. One example would be if you had a recording interface that had SPDIF input and you wanted to record your Helix, not use your Helix as the audio interface, but not go through a digital analog conversion into the analog inputs of your recording interface and then having to convert that back to digital, when we could just take the SPDIF output, plug it directly into our mixing console, if it had that in SPDIF input, or into a recording interface, and we could record that straight into the recording interface without ever leaving the digital domain, which technically should give us better sound quality. But again, if you don't have a device with an SPDIF input, you're probably not ever going to use this to connect the Helix to. But again, it's great that it's there. We also have this AES EBU output for devices that use that style output, which doubles as the L6 link out. Now, only one of these can be functional at once. And I'm pretty sure that as soon as you plug in the L6 link out, the SPDIF is disabled. And then we have digital out level, which I think is rather obvious. That's just the level that's going to be sent out of our digital output. Normally, again, I would be leaving this at 0 unless there was a situation that arose that I needed to change it. If I page over, only one last thing left in our discussion today, and that is the sample rate. If you have nothing connected to your SPDIF or AES EBU outputs, this is really a meaningless setting. In the manual, it clearly states, it says, note that this setting does not affect Helix USB audio sample rate operation. That would actually be controlled by the software control panel on your computer. So this is just setting the sample rate of the digital outputs. So if you were connected to a recording interface that was going into your DAW, let's say, and it was set at 48 kilohertz and we were hooked up via SPDIF, we would want to make sure that this matches so we didn't run into any problems. And our options are 44.1 kilohertz, 48 kilohertz, 88.2 kilohertz, and 96 kilohertz. So another nice feature. And that's that. That is a look at the in-out portion of the global settings on our Helix. I hope you guys found that useful. I hope that covers a lot of the questions that I've received, and I've received a lot of them over the past few years concerning those. And I thought it would be kind of an interesting thing to go through and really break down on a step-by-step basis. Now, I could have done the entire global settings in this video, but I didn't want it to be 2 hours long. I hope I didn't go on too long with that, and I hope that was concise enough. And I hope I expressed it in a way that was easy to understand. And if you have any questions, leave them for me in the comments below, and I'll try my best to get to you and answer them. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please share this with anybody who you think would get some use out of it. Please like the video to help share the word about it as well. And subscribe to the channel. Hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Really, really appreciate your time. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll be back really soon. Ciao for now.